The dry wind swept across the empty plains, tugging at the brim of his weathered hat, and the lonely cowboy stood there, boots caked with dust, heart weighed down heavier than his saddlebags. He had spent years under the endless sky, driving cattle, fixing fences, and sleeping under the stars with only the coyotes for company. But a man could only live so long with silence as his partner, and silence had never made him a home. The ranch was wide but empty. The fire crackled at night but warmed only one side of the table, and though he'd built everything he had with his bare hands, there was a hole no hammer, rope, or horse could fill. So when the letter came, a promise of a woman willing to cross the miles to stand by his side, he tucked it away in his pocket and reread it each night by the lantern, whispering her name into the darkness, imagining a delicate, soft-spoken lady stepping from the train, all grace and shy smiles, ready to fit into the empty spaces of his world. The day finally came. The train whistle splitting the air as iron wheels screeched against the tracks, echoing across the barren land like the voice of fate. He stood straighter, brushed the dust from his jacket, and adjusted his hat, his heart drumming so loud he thought folks around might hear it. One by one, passengers stepped down, their boots clattering on the wooden platform, families rushing to embrace, merchants pulling trunks, children clinging to their mothers. And then she appeared. He blinked once, twice, his hand gripping the railing for steadiness. She was not the woman of his midnight imaginings. She was tall, taller than him by a good head and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they'd known more work than lace gloves. Her stride shook the platform like a storm rolling through the prairie, and her eyes, fierce and unflinching, landed straight on him. She carried no parasol, no dainty handbag, only a battered trunk slung over her shoulder as if it weighed no more than a sack of grain. The cowboy's throat tightened, his dream crumbling with every heavy step she took, yet something in his chest burned hotter than the noon sun. She stopped in front of him, her shadow falling over his boots, and with a voice that rolled like thunder, she said, "You're John Hartley, the cowboy that sent for a bride?" He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, unable to tear his gaze from her. She tilted her chin, eyes narrowing as if measuring his worth, and for a breath, he thought she might turn back to the train. But then, to his surprise, she smiled, not a delicate smile, but a wide, fearless grin that carried strength and promise. "Well," she said, "I'm the bride that answered. Name's Martha. And I didn't come all this way to be treated like glass. You wanted a partner? Cowboy? Looks like you got one." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut, folks around them pausing to gawk, whispering behind gloved hands at the sight of the mismatched pair. John felt the heat crawl up his neck, shame and doubt whispering like devils in his ear. She wasn't what he'd pictured. She was twice his size, rough around the edges, and already challenging him with her presence. But then he caught something in her eyes, a glimmer of loneliness, a raw honesty that mirrored his own. She had crossed hundreds of miles not for comfort or wealth, but because she too carried an emptiness she longed to fill. And maybe, just maybe, what he needed wasn't what he had imagined, but what fate had truly sent. The journey back to his ranch was awkward at first. She sat tall in the wagon, scanning the land with a quiet hunger, while he struggled for words, fumbling through questions about her travels, her life back east. She told him of factories and crowded streets, of nights spent working until her bones ached, of a world that had no place for a woman who didn't fit the mold. She had been mocked for her size, dismissed for her strength, but instead of bending, she had grown fiercer. "When I read your letter," she said, her voice softer now, "I didn't picture romance in the roses and moonlight way. I pictured someone who wanted a real partner, someone who'd see past what the world sneers at. I figured you were lonely, but I didn't think you were weak. So don't you look at me like I'm a mistake." Her words pierced him deeper than any arrow. He tightened the reins, staring ahead at the dusty trail, and for the first time in years, he felt the heavy chains of pride loosening. Maybe love wasn't meant to be about appearances, but about surviving the storms together. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in fire. She stepped down before he could offer a hand, walked straight to the porch, and admired the sturdy home he had built. "This'll do," she said simply, and with that, she carried her trunk inside like she already belonged. That night, as he watched her cook a meal with practiced ease, filling the kitchen with laughter he hadn't heard in years, he realized something profound. This woman, this unexpected storm of strength, was exactly what his life had been missing. The weeks that followed weren't easy. She challenged him at every turn, rising at dawn to help mend fences, tossing hay bales heavier than he could manage, and calling him out when he tried to shield her from hard work. Neighbors whispered, mocking the cowboy who'd brought home a bride bigger than himself. But Martha stood tall, her back straight, her voice unwavering, and slowly John found himself standing taller too. She taught him that love wasn't about fitting into neat boxes, but about creating something unbreakable together. One evening, after a long day of branding cattle, they sat on the porch watching the stars. The air was quiet except for the crickets, and Martha rested her large, calloused hand over his. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice low. He turned to her, eyes reflecting the starlight, and shook his head. "No, you're not what I expected," he said honestly. "But you're more than I deserved. You came to me when I was nothing but a lonely man with an empty house. And now this place feels alive." She smiled then, softer than he had ever seen, and leaned closer, pressing her forehead to his. In that moment, the cowboy realized the truth. Loneliness had led him to send for a bride, but fate had sent him a woman who would change his life. She wasn't twice his size, she was twice the strength, twice the courage, twice the love he could have ever dreamed of. And as the night wrapped around them, he whispered into her hair, "You're the best thing that ever stepped off that train." The years ahead were bound to be hard, storms, droughts, and the unkind whispers of others, but together they would stand unshaken. For the lonely cowboy had found more than a wife. He had found a partner, a storm, a fire that would burn beside him through all of life's wilderness. And the story spread across the plains, whispered from one dusty town to the next, not of a cowboy who sent for a bride and was surprised, but of a cowboy who learned that love doesn't come in the shape we expect. It comes in the strength we need. So, dear listener, if this story has touched your heart, if you believe love is more than appearances and life is about finding someone who stands with you through every storm, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps these stories alive, keeps the fire burning, and together, we'll share more tales of love, resilience, and the wild, untamed spirit of the human heart.